Ms. Hobbs, Dr. Resner, thank you both for joining me here today. I've come to understand that establishing an institutional review board is really in the best interests of this institution. Ms. Hobbs, can you tell me a little bit about who should serve as a member of the IRB?
Sure, I'd be happy to. First of all, we need to appoint at least 5 members to serve on the IRB, although it may be to our advantage to have 8 to 10 members, since there's no limit on how many members that we can appoint to the IRB.
To demonstrate my commitment to the IRB, I would like to serve as a member.
As signatory official, your primary concern is for the welfare of the institution. I'd actually recommend against you serving as an IRB member. But I believe that you can demonstrate your support to the IRB in other ways.
Okay, so I won't appoint myself as an IRB member. I can ask each department head to identify a physician to serve on the IRB, and that would fulfill the required numbers.
Well, Dr. Quinn, it's a great idea to have multiple physicians on the IRB. However, the members need to have a varying background so that there's a complete and adequate review of each research project. And the regulations do not allow an IRB to be comprised of members from only one profession. Also, in appointing our IRB, we need to give consideration to getting an IRB with diversity in terms of gender, race, and cultural backgrounds, especially given the demographic makeup of our community.
What considerations about gender? Do 50% of the members need to be female?
Well, no, actually there is no regulatory requirement for 50% or any percent of members that would need to be of a certain gender. However, we do need to be careful that we don't discriminate when selecting IRB members, including making selections based on gender. Now, we also need to try to ensure that our IRB does not consist entirely of men or of women.
Okay, I have a different question. Does the research that we currently conduct have a bearing on who should serve on the IRB?
Yes, actually it does. We need to have IRB members with the professional competence necessary to review specific research activities that are submitted to our IRB. Now, since we conduct both biomedical and social and behavioral research studies, we'll need to have experts in both of these areas.
Well, occasionally we conduct very complex studies involving a specialist. Does that mean that we have to have members from every specialty on the IRB?
No, it's a valid question, but we do need to have IRB members with expertise in the type of studies that we would typically conduct. Now, we can supplement our IRB's review by bringing in a consultant to provide a review for the other type of studies that we would not normally conduct.
I think we seem to conduct a lot of studies involving cancer and cardiology, so I think that it would be a good idea for us to have a cardiologist and an oncologist sit on the IRB.
I agree. We also do a lot of research with children and with prisoners, so we would need to have IRB members with this expertise as well.
Okay, I understand why it would be important to have an expert in children's research issues, but an expert in prisoner issues?
Yeah, that person is actually called a prisoner representative. Now, this person's role is to serve as an advocate for the rights and welfare of the subjects who are prisoners.
I happen to know the state prison warden, and I could ask her if she'd be willing to serve as an IRB member.
Although the warden should have a close working knowledge and understanding of the prison conditions, she probably wouldn't be viewing the conditions from the prisoner's perspective. It may be better to identify someone else to serve in this capacity.
Do you have someone in mind?
Yes, a suitable individual that would serve as a prisoner representative would include a present or former prisoner, a prison chaplain, a prison psychologist, or a prison social worker. I happen to know a member of the clergy who routinely visits state prisons. I think that he would have the appropriate background to represent the rights and welfare of the prisoners.
Okay, so we have a couple of physicians and a minister on the IRB. And I believe you said 8 to 10 members. Who else were you thinking that we might ask to be an IRB member?
Well, we need to have at least one scientist, one non-scientist, and one non-affiliated member on the IRB. Now, the physicians are considered to be scientists, and in general, the clergy member would be considered to be a non-scientist.
So I guess the value of a non-scientist role on the IRB is that they can review the research from the point of view of a layperson and look at the language in the informed consent document and the reading level.
You are absolutely right. Now, in addition, there needs to be a non-scientist present to meet quorum requirements.
So what happens if the non-scientist needs to leave the room temporarily?
Well, the meeting can't continue in the absence of a non-scientist. The non-scientist must be present for the IRB to conduct its review and approval of studies.
Are physicians the only people who are considered to be scientists?
No, actually, OHRP expects institutions to consider an IRB member's training, background, and occupation when categorizing those members as either a scientist or a non-scientist. Now, those members who have the training, background, and occupation, that would incline them to view research activities from someone within a biomedical or behavioral scientific discipline would be considered to be scientists.
Would a registered nurse be considered a scientist?
Well, sure. In general, registered nurses are considered to be scientists. Now, other professions that would typically be considered to be scientists would include anthropologists, psychologists, and geologists.
I think you mentioned another category, the non-affiliated?
Yes. The regulations require the IRB have at least one non-affiliated member.
Who would be considered a non-affiliated member?
Well, this person can have no affiliation with our institution except as an IRB member, a patient, a former student, or a subject in a research study. Also, the non-affiliated member cannot be an immediate family member of someone that is otherwise affiliated.
Why is there a requirement for a non-affiliated IRB member?
Well, the non-affiliated member serves an important role in the IRB as they can help represent the outside community. They will help reduce institutional conflict of interest, and they can enhance our IRB's diversity.
So is the non-affiliated member the same thing as a community member?
No. Now, a community member is not a regulatory term, but this is actually a commonly used term that refers to an IRB member that's serving in a dual role of both the non-affiliated member and the non-scientist.
Is it okay to have one IRB member serve in two different roles? Can we get a twofer?
Well, I've never heard that term before, but yes, it is acceptable to have one person serving in two roles. For example, a minister from the community could be the non-affiliated member and the non-scientist.
So switching gears a little bit, you said earlier that the meeting cannot continue in the absence of the non-scientist. Are there any other situations in which we'd have to stop the meeting?
Yes, actually there are. Now, if the number of IRB members present at the meeting is less than a majority, the IRB cannot conduct business. So, for example, if we had an IRB of 8 members and only 5 were present for the meeting, and one of those 5 members had to leave the meeting to take a phone call, we would have to suspend the meeting until that member returned.
So the same thing for the non-scientists if they leave the room, regardless of the actual number in attendance?
That's right. You're catching on. Maintaining quorum is very important, since without it, the IRB cannot review or take actions on any project that requires the convened IRB review.
So this means that the IRB cannot do any further business if there's a loss of quorum?
Correct. The IRB cannot conduct any IRB review or take any action until the quorum is restored.
Is there anything else that I should know about how the meeting actually works?
Well, earlier I mentioned our possible use of consultants. Any consultant that we would use would not count towards the quorum and cannot vote. Also, I do feel it's important to talk about conflicting interest, since of the members who are present, none may have a conflict of interest in the projects that are being reviewed.
What would be considered a conflicting interest?
Well, the regulations actually state that no IRB may have a member participate in the IRB's initial or continuing review of any project in which the member has a conflicting interest, except to provide information that's requested by the IRB. Now, someone with a conflicting interest would include an investigator or a research team member being involved in the study, or have a financial interest in that study.
So what happens if an IRB member has a conflict of interest with respect to a project that the convened IRB is reviewing?
Well, the IRB member with a conflicting interest may provide information requested by the IRB, just like any other investigator, but they cannot be counted towards the quorum. OHRP actually recommends that the conflicted member leave the room for the discussion and that they cannot vote on any project on which they have a conflict.
So does that mean that an IRB member with a conflict of interest for one research study can still be counted toward the quorum for another research study that he or she does not have a conflict of interest?
Yes, that is correct.
You have me worried about this whole quorum issue. Is there anything we can do to ensure that we always maintain the quorum?
There certainly is. We could appoint alternate IRB members.
Talk to me about alternates.
An alternate member would be a person that has a similar background and expertise as the regular voting member for whom they would be designated to represent. Now, if we had more than one IRB at this institution, this person could also be a regular voting member from a different IRB at our institution.
And the alternate counts towards the quorum?
Yes, they do. The alternate IRB member does count towards the quorum if the regular voting IRB member is not present, either because he or she is unable to attend the meeting or if the member has been recused because of a conflicting interest.
So if the regular member is conflicted for just one research study, the alternate can count toward the quorum for that one research study?
Yes, the alternate member may substitute for the entire meeting or for only a portion of the meeting.
What did you mean earlier by recused?
A recusal is when an IRB member is removed from the deliberation and vote on a particular project because of a conflict of interest. Now, this person does not count towards the quorum and should leave the room.
So is that the same thing as an abstention?
No, and I'm glad that you asked. Abstention is actually a separate concept and has a different implication from a regulatory perspective. An IRB member who abstains from voting is counted towards the quorum. Now, let me emphasize that an abstention may be done for reasons other than a conflict, which, as I've mentioned, requires recusal.
So if a member abstains from voting on a particular project, they just don't want to vote yes or no on it. So I guess that could be for a number of reasons. Perhaps they just don't want to vote on it, or they have some sort of discomfort with it, or they just don't have a good bit of knowledge about the study.
That is correct. But again, I want to emphasize that the member abstaining from the vote does not have a conflict of interest.
Are there any requirements for how IRB members should be appointed?
There's no regulatory requirements for how members are appointed, but OHRP recommends that institutions have written procedures for selecting and appointing its IRB members.
Okay, do you have any ideas, and I bet you do, about what you'd want to see in these written procedures?
Yes, actually I do. Now, we need to have a list of the type of clinical expertise that we would want certain members to have who would serve on the IRB. There are a lot of details that we will need to discuss, such as who within the institution is authorized to make the IRB selection, the length of time that the IRB member will serve, the reasons that we would ask an IRB member to step down, and the type of training that the IRB members will be given.
IRB members are required to have special training?
There is no regulatory requirement for training, although the terms of our federal-wide assurance with OHRP do strongly recommend that we establish an educational training program.
What would you want to see included in that training?
Well, I would want to include a review of the ethical principles identified in the Belmont Report, a review of both the HHS and FDA regulations, as well as some pertinent OHRP guidance documents. I would also recommend that IRB members review the human subject assurance training modules that are available through the OHRP website.
And do you have any other suggestions for IRB members?
I do. I think that we should consider providing some type of incentive to the IRB members for their service to the IRB.
Incentives are great, but we always have to keep in mind that we have limited resources.
I realize that we have limited resources, but the incentives don't need to cost a lot of money. We could consider incentives such as a small stipend, protected time, free lunch and free parking, or some type of recognition for their work on the IRB.
But wait a minute, if we offer an unaffiliated member a stipend, doesn't that make them an employee and therefore affiliated?
No, providing incentives, including giving the otherwise non-affiliated member a stipend based on the reasonable market value for their member's services, would not make that IRB member affiliated with our institution.
Do you have any other ideas that we should keep in mind for our IRB?
Well, a person would need to be selected who's going to serve in the capacity of the IRB chair.
What particular qualifications should the chair have? I know somebody who has served on the IRB of another institution for 5 years.
That person might be a great person to select as IRB chair. Now, the regulations do not mandate that there are any specific requirements or any kind of qualifications for the IRB chair. The person selected as the chair should have experience serving on an IRB and needs to be willing to make a commitment to the IRB, since serving as chair is usually a bigger time commitment than serving as an irregular IRB member. Now, lastly, selecting and appointing an IRB chair is left up to our institution to make that decision.
Ms. Hobbs, Dr. Resner, I just want to thank you both very much for your time today. I know you're both extremely busy, and this has been incredibly helpful. With your dedication and your knowledge, I believe that we are really well on our way to establishing an effective, efficient IRB that will be appropriate for this institution.
Good. Thank you very much.